People don't always need a knife to stab you in the back. Sometimes, all it takes is silence when they should have spoken up. I learned that on a Monday morning in Chicago, in the very conference room I once considered my second home. My name is Cynthia Parker, and I used to be the head of content strategy at NovaSpark Media, a creative agency that specialized in emotional marketing. I never claimed to be the best, but in the 6 years I worked there, no campaign left the creative department without my fingerprints on it. I still remember the cold coffee on the table, the loose thread on my blazer sleeve, and the way eyes turned away, eyes that had once shared lunch with me every day. They all avoided looking when Ethan Wade, the CEO, someone I once considered like an older brother, delivered the decision, "We're sorry, Cynthia, but due to internal restructuring and a shift in strategic direction, your position is no longer a fit." That sentence, recited like the outcome of some distant meeting, didn't just terminate a job. It ended a chapter of my life into which I had poured everything I had. The room was flooded with LED light, yet everything inside me dimmed. I didn't cry. I even smiled and nodded, politely, as if I agreed with the way they erased my name from the company roster. But inside, I knew this wasn't restructuring. This was premeditated. A month earlier, I had led a successful rebranding campaign for Harper & Vance, a high-end fashion label struggling with outdated perception. My team and I had worked through nights, even sleeping at the office on occasion. The campaign soared, driving a 38% jump in quarterly sales. I thought it would finally earn me recognition, but the person publicly praised was Rachel Saunders, a newly transferred deputy from our New York headquarters. Rachel had a personal connection with Ethan. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. I sensed something was wrong the day she insisted on co-presenting the strategy deck to the client. And in that meeting, slide after slide, line after line, she presented my work as if it were her own. Ethan didn't correct her. He didn't say a word about my contribution. And today, he was the one walking me out of the office I had helped build. I left the building with a small box in my hands. Inside were a few strategy books, an old photo of our team from a retreat in Boulder, and a little cactus I had kept on my desk. I planted that cactus during my early intern days, believing that caring for something each day would make me more patient, more grounded. I paused on the steps outside NovaSpark, where the silver signage shimmered in the sunlight, then turned away without looking back. Some places, once you leave them, you shouldn't return to, not even in memory. The days that followed were drenched in silence. My phone didn't ring. My inbox was empty, except for a few severance documents. I deactivated LinkedIn because I couldn't bear to see the congratulations on Rachel's promotion. I avoided Madison Street just to dodge any chance encounters with former coworkers. I didn't feel hollow because of the layoff, but because of the silence from people I had once called friends. I had been so deeply tied to NovaSpark. I loved our coffee-fueled brainstorming sessions, the thrill of seeing a campaign go live and spark waves of engagement, even the exhaustion of late nights shared with others who burned just as fiercely. I believed in the durability of relationships built on shared ideals. But now, I found myself wondering whether any of it had ever been real, or if it had all just been a thin emotional veneer, masking a system always ready to replace you with someone more politically convenient. I moved back to my mother's old apartment in Evanston, a quiet suburb with a balcony overlooking a small park, every morning. I sat with a cold cup of coffee and an open laptop, fingers still, but thoughts racing. The ideas were still there. My mind was still sharp, but my trust had worn thin. I had once dreamed of starting my own agency. That dream used to blaze inside me, but now I asked myself, was I still enough to begin again one day? A plain envelope arrived in the mail, no return address. Inside was a clipped page from an industry magazine where Rachel was being interviewed. She talked about the innovative content strategy she had personally developed for Harper & Vance. That article was the final drop, not because she stole credit, but because I realized if I stayed silent, the story would be rewritten by those who shouted louder that night. I sat down at my screen and typed my first words in 3 weeks. Plan D. Not because A, B, or C had failed, but because this time would be different. No rage, no noise. I would take revenge through success, not by knocking on Nova Spark's door or confronting them. I would start from zero, rebuild from the ground up, and remind them of one truth. Real value isn't about being accepted by someone. It's about not needing them and still going further. The chapter with Nova Spark had closed, but the prologue of my comeback had just begun, written by my hand. In the same silence they once mistook for weakness. At first, I only meant to write a plan to stop myself from spiraling. But the more I typed, the more I realized that something was returning. Not trust, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after believing in the wrong things for too long, after trying too hard and breaking too quietly. I knew then, if I didn't pull myself out of this, no one would, every night. I sat at the small desk in my mother's old apartment, under the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp, sketching out the blueprint of a small agency, one where no one had to prove their worth every day, just to be heard. I named it Parker and West. West was my mother's maiden name, the woman who once gave up her career and education to raise me. The name felt gentle but grounded, like something that could last. I filed the paperwork online, rented a tiny desk in a co-working space in Fulton Market. All I needed was a table, a whiteboard, and a decent Wi-Fi signal. There was no launch event, no inspirational post, just me and the quiet certainty that this time, everything would be. I started with what was left, some old strategic documents, edited legally, a few personal contacts I had nurtured during my Nova Spark years, and a memory no one could copy. I didn't send out announcements or ask anyone to refer me clients. I simply picked 3 names from my list, people who once said, "If you ever start something of your own, tell me first," and wrote them a short message. No pitch, no pleading, just, "I've started over. If you still need someone who understands how to tell a story with precision and feeling, I'm here." A week later, the first reply came from Dean Whitaker, communications director at Bloomfield Hotels. He remembered me for a campaign I led the previous year, where we told the story of the hotel not through rooms or services, but through the voices of housekeepers and maintenance staff. "Cynthia, I didn't know you left Nova Spark. That's their loss. Are you still taking freelance?" I told him I wasn't freelancing, but I could lead a small team that worked with focus and flexibility. A few days later, our first contract was signed. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to remind me I still had a place in this world. I didn't hire people through resumes. I met them over coffee, in places without name tags or business cards, where the only currency was honesty about what they had been through. I chose Leah, a copywriter who had been let go from a major agency. Even though she had written the key message for a national campaign, I chose Malik, a designer passed over for promotion because he didn't play internal politics. They didn't have to prove anything to me. They only had to tell me why they stayed silent. We didn't talk about comebacks or revenge. We just worked, quietly. But I knew deep down, we didn't start this company to survive. We started it to prove that emotion isn't a weakness in marketing. It's an asset. And I would rebuild everything based on that principle. It wasn't easy to hold on to belief without a safety net. There were days when clients went silent, weeks when only one email came in. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, palms damp, wondering what I was doing here. My mother would bring me ginger tea. Say nothing. Just place it on the table and whisper, "When you planted that cactus, did you know when it would bloom?" I shook my head. She smiled. "It only blooms when it senses the conditions are safe enough to live again." That line stayed with me as I headed down to our small office, tucked inside an old building with a creaky elevator and scratched glass doors. I pinned a blank sheet to the board and wrote 3 words across the top: broken trust. That was the seed. A new campaign began to take shape, centered around restoring trust with customers through authentic experience, not spectacle. Leah and Malik helped me shape the deck. While I worked on the pitch for a small ed tech startup, they had once been a potential NovaSpark client, but Rachel had turned them away for having too low a budget. When I walked into that meeting, there were just 2 founders and a whiteboard covered in half-erased yearly goals. They looked exhausted, unsure about emotional marketing. I listened. I didn't introduce my company. I just told them about the time a hotel janitor felt seen for the first time in her life after her story went viral. I spoke calmly, without trying to convince, only describing. Then I made the offer. No flashy commercials, no viral campaigns. Just rewrite your recruitment policy in a tone that teachers actually want to hear. Soon after, we were chosen as their pilot partner. With every new project, I began to understand where real value comes from, not from the name of a former employer, not from a shelf full of awards, but from the courage to say what's right, even when no one else agrees. Meanwhile, whispers about Rachel started to surface. A former colleague sent me a screenshot from NovaSpark's internal Slack. Ethan was asking why the original Harper and Vance strategy file couldn't be found. Rachel responded that she had deleted it after the project ended to save space. The fact that they were now circling back to the work I once did told me there was a gap I had left behind. But I didn't speak up. I didn't need to. Not yet. There were still things to prepare. On my desk, I opened a new file. This time, I titled it Phase 2. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew silence has its own rhythm. And when the time is right, it speaks louder than any press conference. I never intended to stir up chaos, but there are moments when the truth finds its own way to speak. That autumn, the Broken Trust campaign that Parker and West created for Eden, learning the small education company we had just partnered with unexpectedly went viral, not because of a massive ad budget, but because one teacher in Oregon shared their job posting with a caption that read, "This is the first time I've seen an employer write exactly what I've always felt," just a few lines. But it resonated. Thousands of shares followed, mostly from teachers long exhausted from being overlooked. Then, an industry magazine took notice. Our first feature appeared under the marketing column, titled, "The Small Company Redefining Emotion in Content Strategy." They called us a creative team rising from the shadows. I read every line, not with excitement, but with a sensation that felt more like a broken limb slowly healing. But from that very article, the ripple began. It was a Tuesday morning. Leah walked into the office, still holding her hot coffee. Her eyes landed on my computer screen. "You should see this." She handed me a screenshot from LinkedIn. Rachel had commented beneath the article about us. "Some people are better at crafting stories than building strategy. Don't believe everything you read." The words were subtle, seemingly harmless, but anyone seasoned in this field knew what it meant. It was a way to blur the lines between truth and suspicion, a reminder that she was still watching, still unwilling to let me be. But what concerned me more was that, a few days later, a potential client canceled our meeting without notice. No explanation, No email, just disappeared. I started retracing the links, not out of fear, but because I knew exactly how people like Rachel operated. I knew Ethan wouldn't be far behind. They didn't need to confront you openly. They only needed to plant names into casual conversations, drop a few unverified claims, and let others draw conclusions. I had seen them do it before. One former colleague had been pushed aside simply for refusing to revise a report to make the numbers look better. This time, they were playing the same game, only with more finesse. Then I received a strange email. No name, no greeting, just a personal address. One attached file, and the message: "You should know you're being watched." I didn't open the file. Instead, I forwarded it to someone I trusted in cybersecurity. The file turned out to contain access logs from NovaSpark's old internal system. Someone was using my former credentials to monitor which clients I was contacting. I didn't tell the team. I didn't want to unsettle them, but I took the actions I needed to take. First, we overhauled our CRM system. Then, I sent out an internal security memo. I wrote, "We're being noticed, so let the data speak for itself." I used noticed instead of watched because I wanted them to feel empowered, not hunted. But that was also when something unexpected happened. One of NovaSpark's former clients, Aurora Wellness, called me. I remember the voice clearly. Jordan, head of brand, said they felt NovaSpark no longer understood the language they had once built together with me. Cynthia, would you be open to submitting a new proposal for next quarter's campaign? I paused for 2 seconds and said, yes, but this time, everything will be signed under my name. 1 week later, the contract was finalized, no pitch process required. Rachel didn't stay silent. A series of anonymous tweets from a new account began circulating. The posts questioned toxic cultures in small female-led agencies. Phrases like emotional manipulation and ethical facades were repeated, aiming to stir doubt. But I noticed something important. No one tagged me directly. No one dared mention Parker and West by name. They knew I wasn't alone anymore. What they didn't expect was Leah. She traced the image file in one of the tweets and uncovered its metadata. The upload came directly from NovaSpark's internal network. We didn't make noise. I simply passed the information to my lawyer, who sent a formal cease and desist. The account vanished within 3 hours. I never set out to wage war. But the fallout shook NovaSpark. An anonymous post on a career forum named the company directly, alleging that recent creative initiatives are just copies without originals. The comments started invoking my name. One said, "I worked with Cynthia, and I know the difference is real." Another asked, "How long can this company survive without anyone left to copy from?" I didn't reply. I let it all unfold on its own rhythm. But within NovaSpark, a former colleague told me Ethan had begun holding closed-door meetings, instructing staff not to bring up the past and to focus only on current strategy. That was the first sign of a structure beginning to crack. I kept working as always without haste, without pause, but I could see it. The outlines of the old system were beginning to blur. Rachel had been scheduled to speak at an industry conference. The session was canceled without explanation. One of their biggest former clients started publishing posts praising flexible agencies that truly grasped the emotions of their customers. No names were mentioned, but anyone in the field understood the signal. Around the same time, I received a strange email. It was from Emily, a former NovaSpark employee I had only worked with on a few minor projects. She wrote, "I just wanted to say that you've done something many of us were too afraid to do. They once told me not to follow your example. Now I think you're the only one worth following." The final line was an audio attachment. Inside was a short clip from an internal meeting where Ethan said, We must do whatever it takes to ensure no one else follows that path. I listened to that recording on a cold night, with the window slightly open and the sound of cars drifting off down the street. I thought about the old conference table, the scripts I had once drafted line by line, the way Ethan used to say, "You're the only one I trust to hold the soul of the campaign." That soul had left, but not to die. It had left to be reborn in a way they could no longer control. I didn't need to fight back. I only needed to keep going. And the next step was already waiting, for the first time in months. I opened my calendar and wrote a note in my own handwriting. Get ready to return to the stage, not to answer them, but to show them I never left the game. There is a kind of silence that isn't surrender, but preparation. I felt it clearly in every moment of those early winter mornings. When I walked into the Parker and West office and sunlight slanted through the old glass window, casting a soft glow on the dark wooden desk. No one said it aloud, but everyone sensed a shift. We had spent enough time moving quietly to understand that true impact doesn't come from noise, but from a shared purpose. I still hadn't responded to the press, hadn't posted anything on social media, hadn't mentioned the old company, but I knew what needed to arrive was already drawing near. The turmoil inside Nova Spark was no longer a rumor. It had become a visible unraveling. 3 of their major clients began gradually shifting toward smaller agencies. A few of my former colleagues, the ones who had left silently after I did, started messaging not to ask for jobs, but to say they left because they couldn't stand watching real value being distorted. One wrote, "I don't know what you're building, but if you ever need someone who understood how you once thought, I'm ready. I didn't hire everyone, but I kept every word, not for satisfaction, but to remember that some wounds, once healed, become the quietest form of strength." Right then, the first formal invitation arrived from Creative Pulse, the biggest annual media conference held in Austin 2 years ago. I had stood under its spotlight, presenting a campaign that's now been credited to someone else. I still remembered sitting in the audience the year after, watching Rachel take that same stage and accept an award on behalf of a team I had built piece by piece. That year, I said nothing. I just stood up and left before her speech ended. But this time, the invitation landed directly in Parker and West's inbox. The subject line read, "We want a different take on building brands with emotional depth." I didn't hesitate. I made only one condition. I wouldn't speak as a keynote. I would speak as someone who had once been erased and was still standing. The whole team helped prepare. Leah drafted the first version of the talk. Malik designed the slides, free of flashy visuals, built instead on strong, honest keywords. I asked for no videos, no case studies, just fragments of lived experience showing how broken trust had become the most enduring motivation for building something new. A few days before the event, I received a strange email, again from a personal address, but the tone was all too familiar. "If you plan to use that stage to come at us, remember every contract has 2 sides, and we know how to rewrite the other one too." No signature, but I didn't need to guess. I didn't reply. I saved it and forwarded it to my attorney. That was the last time I let threats decide the direction of my next step. On the day of the conference, I didn't wear a dark blazer or a name tag. I chose a plain white shirt and the same old shoes that had carried me through countless pitches years ago. I arrived early and sat for a while near the entrance, letting myself absorb the familiar tension and expectation in the air. When the announcer called my name, I walked onto the stage, not quickly, not slowly, but with every step grounded. The room wasn't massive, but full enough for me to meet every gaze. I started with a simple sentence. Some things don't need slides to be seen clearly, like the disappearance of someone who once built something important. I saw heads lift, no names, no accusations. I shared the days that followed my removal from the very campaign I had created. I talked about choosing silence, not as retreat, but as planning, about how Parker and West wasn't built to compete, but to restore a way of working we had lost to distortion. I spoke about the truth behind emotional strategy, how emotional marketing isn't a tool for manipulation, but a bridge between real value and trust. I ended with a short question. If the person who held up the central beam is pushed out, how long do you think the roof will hold? There was no thunderous applause, but I saw people nod, and more importantly, as I stepped off the stage, someone was already waiting at the bottom of the steps. It was Jordan, from Aurora Wellness. We're thinking about completely reworking our brand positioning for next year. Could you lead that charge? I looked at him and replied, not me, my team, but I'll be out front. That conversation lasted 4 minutes, but it marked the end of our waiting period. I wasn't making a comeback anymore. I was simply continuing. The next day, a photo from the conference began circulating across industry networks. It wasn't a sharp image, but the caption beneath it read, "The one who was crossed out, now redrawing the map." Not long after, a major business publication invited me to write about the journey of building a new agency. I declined the interview, but agreed to submit a short piece. I didn't mention Nova Spark. I named no one. I simply talked about how, after losing recognition, the first thing I did wasn't proving anything to anyone. It was rebuilding my own definition of worth. At the end of the article, I wrote a single line. Not every disappearance is an ending. Some are prologues written in the quietest form. The piece was shared so widely that even I couldn't keep up with all the reposts. At the office, no one talked about it. They worked as usual, but I knew they felt the shift too. At the end of the day, Leah walked over to my desk, rested her hand on it, and asked, "So we're really ready now, aren't we?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window, at the trees fading into late-season gold, and replied softly, "Yes, but this time, it's not to respond, it's to lead." And in that moment, I knew Act 2 had ended, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet agreement that the game now belonged to us. The turning point had arrived, not loudly, not with declarations, just a door opening from within, and my hand was already on the handle. It was time to step through. Coming back didn't feel the way I had imagined. There were no flashes, no roaring applause, no triumphant post shared online. My return came quietly, like the steady ticking of a clock in a room that had forgotten it was still running. On a Monday morning in early March, I walked into the headquarters of Avalon Retail Group in West Loop, carrying an old leather bag with no brand logo and a printed strategic plan tucked inside a recycled folder. It was the biggest meeting I had stepped into since leaving Nova Spark, not because of the client size, but because for the first time, I wasn't walking in asking for a chance. I had been invited, and across the table, in a familiar ash-colored blazer, was Rachel. She looked up, paused for a fraction of a second when she saw me, then quickly returned to her neutral expression. Ethan wasn't there. It seemed he had taken a step back following everything that had unfolded. The meeting was led by Avalon's Vice President of Communications, and I had been invited to propose a new framework for restructuring their internal branding system. Rachel was there representing Nova Spark, offering an alternative approach. No one mentioned the past. No one needed to. Slides moved forward. Voices filtered through the small speaker. When it was my turn, I didn't open a laptop or share a screen. I handed each person a printed copy and said simply, "I'm not bringing you a campaign. I'm offering you a system you can run long after I've stepped away." I never once looked at Rachel during my presentation, but I could feel her eyes tracking every word I spoke. The meeting ended without a final verdict. They said they'd get back to us. I stood, thanked them, and left the room with the calm rhythm I had long practiced. On the way out, I passed Rachel. She didn't say a word, only tilted her head slightly, as if trying to hold on to something left unsaid. I didn't stop. 3 days later, I received a call from Avalon. The voice on the line was brief. "We'd like to move forward with you, starting next month. No explanation needed." I understood exactly what it meant. Nova Spark had been passed over. Still, I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. I simply looked out the window at the trees beginning to bud and quietly added a line to our master plan. Avalon Project Initiate. Word began to spread, not through any official post, but through quiet exchanges in the industry. Nova Spark had lost 2 major clients within the first quarter. Some of their longtime partners began reviewing old contracts. And then, what was bound to happen, happened. An internal memo was leaked from Nova Spark's HR system. It announced a deeper restructuring and the shutdown of 3 departments. Rachel's name was on the list. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't need that kind of ending to prove I'd been right. What struck me more was how everything repeated itself. Same excuse, same type of email, and once again, someone leaving in silence. The only difference was that this time, I wasn't the one being pushed out. We kept going. Parker and West grew slowly but steadily. No aggressive expansions, no mass hiring, but clients kept coming, partly because of our strategy, partly because of how we treated their real stories. I kept the habit of staying late every Friday, alone, just to look over the notes, the in-progress plans, not to control, but not to forget, not forget where we began. One evening, Leah brought me a cup of tea and asked, "Have you thought about writing a book?" I laughed and shook my head. "No need. Everyone's writing it for me. One day at a time." There was no grand meaning behind the words. But a few months later, I received an invitation from a university. They wanted me to speak about rebuilding after betrayal in the creative industry. The session was titled "Real Value in a Shifting World." I said yes, not to tell a revenge story wrapped in success, but because I believe some lessons deserve to be shared properly, from someone who has gone through it without being consumed by bitterness. I returned to Nova Spark's building only once, not to see anyone. It was for an audit meeting where Parker and West had been invited as a third-party evaluator on a cross-agency collaboration. The office had been renovated. The faces were new. There were no sidelong glances, no thin pride stretched across glass walls. I walked the hallway, passed by the desk where I used to sit. A new employee was there now, hunched over their screen, unaware of what had once unfolded. I didn't feel regret, not resentment either, just a small nod to myself, a quiet reminder that some departures are not exits, but distance gained for something greater. That afternoon, I returned to our office and found the team laughing around the lunch table. Malik had placed a small cake with a line of icing across the top that read, "To the real builder." I didn't ask who had ordered it. I didn't need to. I sat down, picked up a fork, and cut a small piece. The sweetness wasn't overpowering, just enough to remind me that some victories need no fanfare, no retaliation. They just need you to remember why you began. When the office emptied out, I stayed behind, walked through each room, looked at the walls still marked with Post-its, the chairs smudged with faint ink stains. Then I entered the main conference room, where the long wooden table stood, the one I had chosen carefully. I bent down and read the small inscription carved beneath the table's edge. She remembered everything, not to dwell on pain, but to mark that I had held on to what mattered most, remembering not to repeat, remembering to tread more wisely. That night, I finished the New Year's strategic plan. At the bottom, instead of signing my name, I simply wrote one line. Sometimes, the best response is no response. Let time deliver the presentation. I turned off the lights and stepped outside. The early spring breeze tugged gently at the hem of my coat. I zipped it up, pulled my hand from my pocket, and walked forward. No turning back, no second thoughts. Some stories don't need a conclusion. They only need to be told at the right moment, in the right way, by the right voice.